It was a hot afternoon when 11-year-old Sabrina Wilkins ran barefoot through the garden. Her mother was at work for a few hours. Sabrina was home alone for the first time. The patio door was open, and the garden was peaceful. Birds were chirping. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Sabrina drew pictures with chalk on the stone floor. Then she disappeared without a sound, without saying goodbye. When her mother returned hours later, the glass of lemonade was still on the table. Her cell phone was charging by the window. But there was no sign of Sabrina. The police launched one of the largest search operations the small town had ever seen. But the years passed, and Sabrina remained missing. Until 15 years later, a forester discovered an abandoned forest hut deep in the woods, and what he found there changed everything. It was July 17, a Tuesday, in the middle of summer vacation. The air was still over the gardens of the small suburban community of Lake Fielda, quiet place somewhere in the foothills of Michigan. Sabrina Wilkins was 11 years old. She was a child who loved to paint, climb trees, and spend hours drawing with chalk on the patio. Her mother, Evelyn Wilkins, was working a late shift at the nearby pharmacy that day. It wasn't the first time Sabrina had been home alone for a few hours. She was mature for her age, responsible. And she knew the rules. Lock the doors, don't let strangers in, call if you're scared. On that day, her mother later recalled, Sabrina was in a good mood. She wanted to finish a mandala she had started the day before. Evelyn left the house around noon. The patio door was open because of the heat. Only the fly screen was closed. At around 4 p.m., Evelyn called from work. No answer. But that wasn't unusual. Sabrina sometimes had her cell phone on silent, or left it in the house. Evelyn returned at 7 p.m. She sensed something was wrong as she approached the house. The front door was unlocked. There was no sound from inside. She called, "Sabrina?" No answer. In the kitchen, there was a half-empty glass of soda. A sandwich lay untouched on a plate. Her daughter's cell phone was on the table. Everything was quiet in the garden, but Sabrina was gone. At first, Evelyn thought her daughter might have gone to a friend's house, maybe Julia's, maybe Maya's, but no one had seen her. A neighbor said she had seen a car on the street around 3:30 p.m. black, with slightly tinted windows. She hadn't thought anything of it. The garden itself showed no signs of a struggle. No overturned chairs, no torn clothing. Only two things stood out later. First, a pink hair clip lying in the middle of the grass oven, though Sabrina had been wearing it that morning. And second, a crushed soda can whose origin could not be determined. At 8 p.m., Evelyn called 911. A few minutes later, the first police officers arrived. They questioned the mother, the neighbors, the friends. A patrol car drove through the neighborhood. Without result, at 9 p.m., the first organized search began. Flashlights, dogs, volunteers. But by midnight, it was clear. The girl had disappeared and no one had seen where she went. No scream, no sound, no trace, only open doors. And one question that would not be silenced for the next 15 years. Where is Sabrina? In the early hours of July 18, the area around the house is systematically searched. Emergency services mark every area in the garden, every hedge, every flower bed. The hope is that Sabrina may have hidden, that she ran away on impulse. Children sometimes do that. But it quickly becomes clear that there is no evidence of an accident. No footprints lead out of the garden. No items of clothing are hanging on the fence. The lawn shows no drag marks, no noticeable impressions. A sniffer dog briefly alerts at the back of the garden, near an apple tree, but the scent disappears after a few meters at the edge of the property. That's also where the paved area ends. Behind it is a public footpath that runs along the housing estate and continues to the country road. The investigators talked to the neighbors. Almost all of them had their windows open because of the heat, but no one claims to have heard anything. No screams, no voices. Only one woman from the neighboring house remembers a faint engine noise passing by her open bedroom window at around 3:15. She thought it was the delivery service. Another neighbor, who was walking her dog, reports seeing a dark vehicle in the Wilkins driveway. It didn't belong there. When she looked, she saw a man getting out of the passenger side. He was wearing a hoodie, even though it was almost 30 degrees. The police take the tip and ask for details, but they can't make out the license plate. All that remains is the impression that the car was black, an older model, possibly a station wagon. Everything is in its place in Sabrina's room. The bed is made, the coloring book lies open on the desk, her favorite penturquoise with a little bear headis on the windowsill. The investigators note, no signs of her leaving voluntarily, no note. No backpack is missing. No shoes were taken. Sabrina was apparently not on her way anywhere she was taken by surprise, or deliberately picked up. An investigator writes in his report, "The garden looks peaceful, almost untouched, and yet it is the last place a living child was seen." The mother is questioned again. She sticks to her statement. Sabrina was never reckless. She had no contact with strangers, was suspicious of unknown people, and didn't trust anyone without reason. But the police are not ruling out any possibilities. Not even that the girl went with someone she knew, or someone who convinced her that she could. The day passes with questions, and with a first inkling that this is no ordinary missing person case, because this garden says nothing, and that is precisely what is so disturbing about it. 2 days after Sabrina's disappearance, a man named Paul Brenner reports to the police station. He lives 3 streets away, is in his early 60s, and is a retired postman. On the day Sabrina disappeared, he was out walking his Labrador, as he did every afternoon. He was walking along a small path that runs behind the residential area, past the gardens of the houses, including the Wilkins house. At around 3:30 p.h., he noticed something unusual. A man was standing at a fence, directly behind the Wilkins property. He was wearing a dark baseball cap, sunglasses, and a gray shirt. He was leaning forward slightly, resting both hands on the fence. The dog barked. The man turned around and quickly walked away toward the footpath. Paul thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. It was only when he heard about Sabrina's disappearance that he remembered the encounter. The investigators listened to his statement. But it is already the 3rd day. The route the man took at the time has been retraced several times. There are no clues, no cameras nearby, no license plate, no face. The tip is noted, but not followed up. The police have now collected over 20 witness statements. Many are vague, contradictory, or too late. But what no one knows is that the man Paul Brenner saw has appeared once before. In another town, an hour away, a child disappeared there too. There too, a witness described a dark cap, sunglasses, and a reserved but commanding body language. This connection will only become apparent many years later. At this moment, in the early stages of the investigation, the statement slips beneath the surface. It gets lost in the mountain of reports and statements. Paul Brenner calls again 3 weeks later. He asks if his statement was helpful. He is told that it has been recorded, but that is all they can do at the moment. He hangs up. He says only one sentence to his wife, "I think I saw the man who took the girl." But by this point, the search has already taken a different turn. The police are now focusing more on the family environment. Because sometimes, according to the official explanation, the truth is closer than you think. 3 days after the disappearance, the story in the small town begins to change. A missing child becomes a public case. Television stations arrive. Reporters stand in front of the Wilkins house. Neighbors hang posters with Sabrina's face in close-up, along with the words, "Who has seen her?" The mother appears at a press conference. Her voice trembles as she holds a photo of her daughter in her hands. She says, "Sabrina, if you're listening, "I'm waiting here. Please come home." People react with sympathy the first few days, but then something changes. A reporter asks about the father. Why isn't he here? Why isn't he standing by his wife's side? David Wilkins, Sabrina's father, hasn't lived with the family for 2 years. The separation was amicable, but they have remained distant. When asked for an interview, he appears cold and emotionless. He says, "I don't know what happened. I hope she's alive. That's all I can say." These words spread, and with them comes speculation. Posts appear on internet forums. Why isn't the father crying? Why does he seem so controlled? Does he have something to hide? The police have to respond. David is questioned. He says he was working at the time in question at a car repair shop 14 kilometers away. His boss confirms this. There is a stamp on the timesheet, but is that enough? The investigators are divided. One of them writes in his report, "The father seems credible, but conspicuously uninvolved." Rebecca, Sabrina's mother, begins to break down. The joint search for the child turns into mutual accusations. She says to a friend, "He could have taken her with him." "I don't know. I don't want to believe it, but I don't know him anymore." David says nothing more in public. He withdraws. The family, which hardly existed as such anymore, falls apart completely. And while reporters still stand in front of the house and cameras are pointed at the driveway, day after day passes without a trace. Without news, without hope, Sabrina remains missing. And for the first time since her disappearance, her mother asks herself, what if she's no longer alive? With increasing desperation, the investigators expand their search. They now retrace every step, checking people who were previously only mentioned in passing. 3 men come into focus, all with connections to the street, the neighborhood, or the family. And all of them tell a story that isn't entirely true. The first is Martin Gelser, 45 years old, who lives at the end of the street, just a few houses away from the Wilkins. He is single, unemployed, and reclusive. Neighbors say he hardly ever goes shopping, avoids conversation, and sometimes photographs birds in the garden with a long camera. The investigators question him. He says he was at home that afternoon, sleeping, but the motion detector in his garage shows several activities between 2:00 and 4:00 p.m. The camera in the entrance area happened to have been removed that very week. Gelser says he wanted to repair the cable. The investigators make a note of this, but there is no evidence of involvement. Just a lie that stands out uncomfortably. The second man is Daniel Voss, a casual acquaintance of Rebecca's mother. They had been in contact a few months ago. A brief acquaintance, nothing serious. But Daniel had a conspicuous interest in Sabrina. He had once given her a gift, without her mother's knowledge, a small stuffed rabbit, supposedly out of kindness. Daniel is questioned. He claims he was in another city on the day of Sabrina's disappearance. But when his alibi is checked, a problem arises. The address he gives does not exist. The gas receipt he presents is in a different name. When confronted about this, he breaks off the conversation. His lawyer later explains that Daniel only lied out of fear. Here, too, no evidence. No DNA, only inconsistencies. The third suspect is a migrant worker. Name unknown, nickname Tommy. He had worked several times during the summer at a construction site nearby. He sometimes slept in his van, which happened to be parked just 3 blocks away that afternoon. Witnesses describe him as friendly but creepy. A girl from the neighborhood claims he once asked her to show him the way to the playground. The police try to track him down, but Tommy disappears. The van is found abandoned, weeks later empty. Clean, no traces. 3 men, 3 possible lies, 3 paths that lead nowhere. The investigators are faced with a dilemma. Each of the 3 fits somehow, but none of them fits clearly. And while all eyes are on these men, there is something no one notices. A small stuffed rabbit, a gift that was not given out of kindness. and which would later, many years later, reappear in an abandoned hut. A clue that was overlooked too early, and that had to remain silent for far too long. At the end of October, more than 3 months after Sabrina's disappearance, a mushroom picker makes an unusual discovery in a wooded area near the city. Among the damp leaves and fallen branches lies a small piece of fabric pale pink with tiny flowers, torn and covered in dirt. At first, the man thinks it's trash, maybe an old cloth or a piece of curtain. But on closer inspection, he realizes it's a dress. Childlike, tiny, and strangely familiar. He takes his find to the police. There it is, examined, photographed, and carefully dried. Sabrina's mother is asked to look at the dress. When she sees it, she freezes. She says only one sentence. That was from her favorite doll. Sabrina had a doll named Meowith, brown curls, and a pink dress. This dress was important to her. She took it everywhere with her. And now this very item is lying in the lab. The police immediately launch a new search. Over 50 officers comb through the woods. Dogs, drones, volunteers. They find animal bones, an old bicycle, a thermos flask, but no sign of Sabrina. No blood, no hair, no clothes, nothing. A young investigator asks the question, why is a doll's dress lying in the middle of the woods, and how did it get there? The mother says Sabrina never took the dress out of the house. It had always been in the children's room with the doll. That means someone took it and left it there. Maybe as a distraction, maybe as a message, but the trail leads nowhere. After 3 days, the search is called off. The dress is archived, the file grows, and the forest remains silent. Later, many years later, a forensic scientist will say in an interview, "We looked in the right place back then, but not deep enough, and not at the right time, because what lay hidden there was still asleep, waiting to be found." The years pass. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. Sabrina's case slips out of the headlines. The posters yellow on the lampposts. The framed photos in the windows slowly disappear. The media only reports sporadically, on anniversaries, in reruns, when there are parallels in other cases. The investigation files are moved to a large gray cabinet in the basement of the police station. Officially, the case remains open, but no one is actively working on it anymore. Rebecca Wilkins stays in Lakefield. She quits her job at the pharmacy and withdraws more and more into herself. The garden grows wild. The table where Sabrina last sat remains untouched. Her favorite pillow, the one with the little stars, lies on the chair. David Wilkins, her father, moves to another state. He remarries and has a son. In interviews, he no longer mentions Sabrina. His new family avoids the subject, but the traces remain, not in files, in thoughts, in dreams. Rebecca attends church regularly. She doesn't talk to anyone there. She sits in the back pew, lights a candle, looks ahead without words, without movement. Once, after one of these services, she says quietly to the pastor, "I think I hear her sometimes." When it rains, very quietly. The pastor doesn't ask any further questions. In all these years, there is only one person who has never given up on the case. Detective Ed Harmon, now retired, formerly in charge of the search. He has a box with the name Sabrina Wilkins on it. Inside, printouts, photos, cards, notes, newspaper articles. He opens the box every year on Sabrina's birthday. He reads the same reports over and over again. And every time, he thinks he's overlooked something. "We failed her," he once says to a colleague as they part. "She was 11, and we were too slow." No one answers, because what can they say? The guilt is silent, but it remains. It's late afternoon in mid-September, 15 years after Sabrina's disappearance. The forest, 60 kilometers north of Lakefield, is quiet. almost deserted. A man named Travis Holt is out there. In his early 50s, a forest ranger, he's on his way to check an old wildlife camera. The path leads him to a remote part of the forest that hardly anyone knows. There, hidden between fir trees and fallen logs, stands an abandoned cabin. It is crooked, made of wood, with a collapsed roof. Most people would have overlooked it. But Travis wants to make sure that no animals have taken up residence there. As he approaches, he stops abruptly. A noise comes from inside. At first, he thinks it's a bird, maybe a badger. But then he hears it again, muffled, scratching, a whimper. He calls out, no answer. He cautiously approaches the door and pushes it open. It's dark inside. Dust covers everything. Old cardboard boxes, a mattress, a collapsed table, and in the far corner, something that looks like a makeshift bed. There, Travis finds bones. Not many, small, fragile. Next to them, scraps of fabric, a gray stuffed rabbit with only one ear, and a bracelet, pink, with letters engraved on it, Sabrina. Travis immediately calls 911. When the police arrive, the cabin is cordoned off. Forensic investigators secure every inch. It's not an animal shelter, not a hunting hideout. It's a place where someone lived, or held captive. The police speak of human remains, clothes, toys, and a backpack with childish patches. That same evening, Rebecca Wilkins is informed. She is standing on her porch when two officers cautiously get out of the car. They don't say much, just, "We believe we have found your daughter." Rebecca says nothing. She sits down on the step and begins to tremble. 15 years after the day when a garden was left empty, Sabrina is back. Not alive, but found. And what was in that shed was only the beginning. The remains from the shed are taken to a forensic laboratory about 2 hours away from Lakefield. A special team takes over the investigation, experienced in working with decades-old finds. What they find there shocks even the investigators, who are used to seeing a lot. The bones are undoubtedly those of a child, female, between 10 and 12 years old. The DNA sample is compared with an old saliva sample taken from Sabrina years earlier during a school examination. The result is clear. The remains belong to Sabrina Wilkins. The cause of death cannot be determined with certainty. The skull shows a fine fracture, possibly caused by blunt force. Some of the ribs are broken, but it is impossible to say whether this was caused by violence or decay. In the hut, investigators find traces of blood on the wooden slats. They also find blood on a blanket hidden under the bed. In a crack in the wall, they discover a piece of fabric with a hair inside. This hair is long, dark, and male. The DNA match brings a surprise. There is a hit in the database. The name, Dennis Rourke. 15 years ago, he was registered near Lakefield. At the time, he was briefly questioned because he was working as a demolition worker on Wilkins Street. His statement at the time was that he had never seen Sabrina. He said he had only been in town for a few days. The investigators at the time believed him. There was no reason to investigate further. But now his DNA is in the cabin. Rourke now lives in another state and works as a mechanic. The police contact him immediately. He appears calm, almost surprised. He says, "I don't remember. I was never in that cabin." But the evidence tells a different story. A hair, a fiber imprint on the ceiling, and a pair of glasses found under the floorboard, exactly the same model that Rourke wore at the time. An investigator later says, "It was as if he never believed this place would ever be found." The police question him again. He remains silent. And then he asks a counter-question. "What if I wasn't alone?" A sentence that changes everything. Suddenly, a new suspicion arises, that Sabrina was not only held captive by one person, but that someone knew about it, kept quiet, or even helped. After the initial investigation of the cabin, the investigators return once more. They want to examine every piece of wood, every floorboard, every wall. One of the officers notices an uneven spot on the back wall. The wood sounds hollow when he taps it with his flashlight. A small nail sticks out at an angle, behind it a crack in the wood. They carefully remove the boards. Behind them, a second room opens up barely larger than a storage closet. No windows, no power lines, just a thin mattress on the floor and a pile of boxes. Inside the boxes, a monitor, an old video camera, and several dusty videotapes. The air in the room is stale, dry, almost artificially still. An investigator says quietly, "This was no place to live. This was a dungeon." The material is examined in the lab. The camera no longer works, but most of the tapes are playable. What the investigators see on them is beyond imagination. Childlike voices, a hand reaching into the frame. Scenes from the hut, recognizable by the structure of the walls. In one recording, Sabrina can be seen sitting in a corner, her eyes downcast. Her clothes are dirty. She looks thin and exhausted. The recording has no date. There is no sound except for a faint humming, but her face is unmistakable. There is no doubt. On another tape, another child, unknown, a girl about 10 years old. She is also sitting on the same mattress. The investigators freeze the image. They start a search in the National Missing Persons database. The second girl is identified 2 days later. She was 8 years old and disappeared 8 years ago in a neighboring state. Her case was also never solved. This confirms that Sabrina was not the only victim. The cabin was no coincidence. It was part of something bigger, and that means Dennis Rourke lied. Or he was only part of it. An accomplice. A confidant. Or not the only one who knew about this door. With the new findings from the cabin, the investigators cross-examine Dennis Rourke again. They confront him with the video footage, with the second room, with the tape showing Sabrina. But Rourke says nothing. No confession, no explanation. Just one sentence. "I wasn't there alone." The investigators are now scrutinizing his entire environment. Old friends, colleagues, former roommates. One of them stands out in particular, Roy Kelmer. In his mid-50s, an electrician with multiple convictions for burglary and assault. Back then, 15 years ago, Kelmer claimed to have been in another state at the time in question. His alibi at the time. He was working on a renovation project several hours away. The address actually exists, but the company filed for bankruptcy at the time, and no one can confirm that Kelmer was there. An old construction site plan that investigators happened to find in a basement storage room contains a list of personal details. Roy Kelmer's name is on it, but with a note, "Did not show up, replacement requested." This means that his alibi was never genuine. The police are now combing through his old property, which was sold shortly after Sabrina's disappearance. The current owner allows them to search the property. Behind a wall panel in the garage, they find a metal box. Inside are personal items, an old set of keys, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a student ID card. The ID card is old and slightly dirty, but clearly legible. The face on it is Sabrina's. The name, date of birth, and elementary school logo are all correct. The investigators cannot say exactly when the ID card came into Kelmer's possession, but the fact that he kept it hidden all these years is proof enough that he knew more. In a notebook, also in the box, they find location details, scribbled dates, numbers, place names. One of them reads, "Cabin, Week 3. For the investigators, it's clear. Kelmer was in the hut. He knew the place. He was part of it. But when he is questioned, he only says, "I don't remember anything." He refuses to make any statement. And without a confession, without clear evidence of his presence at the time of the crime, it remains a suspicion. But the investigators' faces have long since revealed what they think. The cabin was planned. The location was prepared. And Sabrina wasn't there by chance. She was chosen, held captive, and forgotten by people who had alibis, which have long since collapsed. While cleaning out her garage, Rebecca Wilkins comes across an old cardboard box, dusty, unopened for years. Inside, school notebooks, photos, a box of craft supplies, and a small portable tape recorder with a built-in speaker. Next to it is a cassette tape labeled with the name Sabrina. Rebecca recognizes the device immediately. It used to be in the kitchen. Sabrina had sometimes used it to record messages for her mother. She sits down, inserts the cassette, presses play. A faint hissing sound, then a familiar voice. Sabrina. She speaks slowly, as if playing a game. "Mom, I'm outside. I put my shoes on. I think someone's here." Then, a faint metallic sound in the background. Footsteps? A gust of wind? Sabrina whispers on. "I'm in the garden. I won't go away, I promise." Then silence. A click. The recording ends. Rebecca listens to the message over and over again. She trembles. Then she calls the police. The investigators analyze the recording. They date it to the afternoon of July 17, the day Sabrina disappeared. A technician cleans up the audio track, filtering out background noise. Then you can hear it more clearly. A faint squeak, like an old door opening, and a word. Almost incomprehensible, but there. Quiet. Whispered. Deep. Male. The tape is old. It was never erased, never recorded over, and it contains the last words of a girl who was standing in her own garden and knew that something was wrong. The investigators check the voice. Comparative analyses are carried out, but no clear match. Nevertheless, for the police, the recording is a turning point. It proves that Sabrina did not run away. She was in the garden, she was careful, and she knew she was being watched. And someone was close enough to force her to whisper. Those few seconds on the tape may be the only moment when Sabrina was able to tell the truth herself. And she did it quietly, like a child who didn't want to be a burden to anyone. 5 days after the tape recording was found, a woman contacted the police. Her name is Helen Marks. She is 80 years old and still lives on the same street as she did back then. She says she kept quiet for years because she thought her observation was meaningless. But after the new developments, she was sure it was important. On the afternoon of Sabrina's disappearance, she had been sitting in her living room with the window open, looking directly at the Wilkins house. Around 3:30 p.m., she noticed a movement at the patio window, a shadow. At first, she thought it was Sabrina, but then she saw a figure tall, dressed in dark clothes, wearing a cap or hood. The person stood still, just for a moment, then they disappeared from view. Helen thought it might have been the father, or a visitor. It wasn't until the police showed up that evening that she felt uneasy, but she didn't report it. She was afraid she was mistaken. Now, 15 years later, she can no longer remain silent. The investigators take Helen's statement seriously. She hesitates, then points to Dennis Rourke. That's what he looked like. Maybe with a beard, but the posture, the shoulders that fits. It's not proof, but another clue. Someone was there that day. Silent. Waiting. They reconstruct the angle of her view. It matches exactly with the patio door where Sabrina was last seen, where she pressed play and disappeared. The shadow Helen saw was real, possibly the last person to see Sabrina conscious. In old files, a young investigator finds a repeatedly mentioned address, a decaying property on Glenbrook's outskirts, once owned by Rourke's late uncle. It had never been search overgrown, legally obscure, long considered vacant. The investigators visit. Rusted gate, boarded windows, The house smells of mold and decay. But upstairs, a clean room. Children's drawings on the walls. In a drawer, blurred photozone shows a girl on the same mattress later found in the cabin. In the attic, they find a rusted metal box. Inside, a hand-drawn forest map. A red circle marks the cabin's exact location. Below it, emergency shelter, only in case of emergency. The hut wasn't random. It had been prepared perhaps for years. Perhaps for Sabrina. 2 months later, Sabrina is buried near the forest. The town creates a small memorial. A cross, a white bench, a carved tree. Her mother, Rebecca, sits in silence. A letter is read. "You were silent for 15 years. Now we hear you again. In your smile, your voice, your courage. You weren't lost. You were taken, and you were found." The case remains open. Rourke and Kelmer say nothing. Evidence exists, but not enough. The file is closed, yet unresolved. The cabin is gone. So is the house. But in the quiet landscape, a bench remains. Sabrina, 11 years old, gone, found, and never forgotten. If you enjoyed watching this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. It only takes 5 seconds, and it would help me a lot on my journey. See you.